50 Apache warriors surrounded Tobias McCrae's cabin at dawn, their war paint gleaming in the morning light. And every single one of them wanted the girl he'd hidden inside. 3 hours earlier, Tobias had been checking his trap lines near Pine Creek when he heard the gunshots echoing across the Sierra Nevada mountains. Can you save the enemy who killed the person you loved most? Tobias "Bear" McCrae faced that question on a September morning in 1878, and his answer would change everything. The man standing at that creek was built like the mountains themselves. 6'2", shoulders broad as an axe handle, arms thick from 12 years of trapping and surviving in the wilderness. His beard was a tangle of brown and silver, wild as the pines around him, and his hair hung past his shoulders, usually tied back with leather cord. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who'd wrestled nature and won more times than he'd lost. But his eyes, pale blue like winter ice, held something deeper than just survival instinct. They held the weight of 3 years of grief. Those weren't hunting shots he heard that morning. Tobias knew the difference. He'd heard enough gunfire in his 39 years to recognize an army rifle from a hunting piece. These were Springfield carbines, the kind cavalrymen carried. And they sounded desperate, final, like someone was making their last stand. Smart men minded their own business in 1878 California. The Apache wars were heating up, reservations were filling, and tensions ran hot as summer stones. Getting involved meant choosing sides, and choosing sides meant dying. Tobias had already lost everything 3 years ago when Apache raiders hit the settlement where his wife Elizabeth worked as a nurse. He'd been out on a hunting trip, came back to find her body and 20 others. Since then, he'd lived alone in his cabin, avoiding both whites and Indians, speaking to maybe 5 people a year, existing more than living. But something about those shots pulled at him. Maybe it was the memory of Elizabeth, who'd never turned away from someone in need. Maybe it was the fact that he'd become half-dead himself these past 3 years, and dead men had nothing left to lose. Whatever the reason, Tobias urged his horse toward the sound, knowing full well he should be riding the opposite direction. What he found behind a fallen pine tree changed the course of his life. A young Apache girl lay bleeding into the dry earth, an army bullet lodged deep in her shoulder. She couldn't have been more than 17, slim and wiry, like young warriors tended to be, with long black hair matted with pine needles and blood. Her buckskin dress was soaked crimson on the left side, and her breathing came in short, pained gasps. But it was her eyes that stopped Tobias cold. Dark as midnight, fierce as a hawk's, they showed no fear, only defiance, only rage at the unfairness of dying young. Tobias's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle. 3 years ago, Apache raiders had killed Elizabeth. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to ride away, let nature take its course. The territory would be one less warrior to worry about. But those eyes, they reminded him of Elizabeth's, not in appearance, but in their absolute refusal to surrender to the inevitable. The girl tried to crawl away when she saw him, leaving a thick trail of blood on the fallen pine bark. She spoke rapid Apache, words he didn't understand, but her meaning was clear as creek water. Stay back. Don't touch me. I'd rather die than accept help from you. Tobias dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. The girl's breathing was getting weaker with each second. Without medical attention, she'd be dead within the hour. He could see the bullet wound clearly now, high on the shoulder, bleeding steady and dark. Not spurting, which meant it had missed the major vessels, but deep enough to kill through blood loss if left untreated. He thought about Elizabeth, about the promise he'd made at her grave to never let hatred consume what was left of his soul. She'd spent her whole life helping people, never asking their color or creed. She'd taught him field medicine during their 12 years together, shown him how to stitch wounds and set bones and fight infections with whatever herbs grew wild. She'd believed in healing, not revenge. Tobias scooped the girl into his arms. She fought at first, weakly, her good arm pushing against his chest. Then she went limp from blood loss. She was lighter than he'd expected, severely malnourished, probably fleeing with her band for weeks. He could feel her ribs through the buckskin, could feel the fever already starting to burn in her skin. The ride back to his cabin felt like it lasted a lifetime. Every shadow could hide a war party. Every bird call might signal pursuit. Every branch snap made his hand twitch toward his pistol. But Tobias pressed on, the girl's labored breathing the only sound between them besides his horse's hooves on the rocky trail. At his cabin, he carried her straight to the sturdy oak table where Elizabeth used to prepare medicines. He laid the girl down on fresh blankets and began heating water and gathering supplies. The bullet needed to come out immediately. He'd done field surgery before, on himself mostly, once on a rancher who'd been gored by a bull, but never on someone this young, this close to death. As he heated his knife in the fire, preparing for the crude surgery that would either save her life or end her suffering quicker, the girl's eyes opened. She stared at him with a mixture of confusion and terror. Why was this white man helping her? What did he want in return? Tobias met her gaze and spoke slowly, carefully, in English. Not killing, helping. She didn't understand the words, but perhaps she understood the tone. Or perhaps she was just too weak to care anymore. When he offered her a strip of leather to bite down on, she took it without protest. "This gonna hurt you more than me," Tobias said, more to himself than to her. "Probably hurt me too, listening to it. But we both gotta get through this." The girl's eyes flickered with something, understanding maybe, and she bit down on the leather. Her hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, whole body tensed for pain. Tobias began working on the wound. For 20 agonizing minutes, he dug out the bullet and fragments of torn cloth while she bled and trembled. The girl bit down on that leather strap hard enough to leave teeth marks, but she didn't scream. Not once. Apache warriors, even the young ones, were trained from childhood to endure pain in silence. It was a point of pride, a demonstration of strength. But Tobias could see the agony in her eyes, in the way her whole body shook, in the tears that leaked from the corners of her eyes, no matter how hard she tried to stop them. He worked as quickly and carefully as he could, his own hands shaking. Not from the blood or the difficulty of the surgery, but from memory. The last time he'd done this was for Elizabeth, trying desperately to save her from a stomach wound that no amount of skill could fix. He'd failed then. He couldn't fail now. Finally, mercifully, the bleeding stopped. The wound was clean. Tobias stitched it closed with the careful precision Elizabeth had taught him, then packed it with a poultice of herbs. The girl had passed out from pain and exhaustion halfway through, which was a blessing. Her face, relaxed in unconsciousness, looked even younger than he'd thought. Just a child, really. Someone's daughter. That's when Tobias heard the war drums in the distance, growing closer with each rhythmic beat. He stepped to the cabin window and looked out into the darkness. Nothing yet, but those drums meant something. They weren't random. They were organized, purposeful. A search party, maybe. Or a war band looking for revenge. Tobias looked back at the girl lying unconscious on his table. He'd saved her life, probably. but in doing so, he might have signed his own death warrant. If her people found her here, wounded, in a white man's cabin, they'd assume the worst: kidnapping, torture, assault. They wouldn't stop to ask questions or listen to explanations. The drums stopped at sunrise, and that's when Tobias knew they'd found his ranch. Silence was worse than noise. Silence meant they were here. He peered through a gap in the wooden walls and counted them. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 50. 50 mounted warriors painted for war, surrounding his property in a perfect circle. No gaps, no escape routes. They'd done this before, had it down to a science. Their leader sat tall on a painted stallion at the center. An older man, maybe mid-40s, with gray streaks in his braided hair and deep scars across his bare chest that spoke of countless battles survived. His face was carved from stone, emotionless and terrifying in its calm. This was a man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation if honor demanded it. The girl stirred behind Tobias, fever burning through her small frame. She whispered something in Apache, her voice barely audible. Tobias didn't need translation. Even half-conscious with fever, she was calling for her father. The war chief raised his hand, and the circle tightened. 50 horses stepped forward in perfect unison, their riders' eyes fixed on the cabin. Tobias could see the fury in those eyes, the grief, the determination. These weren't raiders looking for cattle or supplies. These were fathers and brothers and uncles who'd tracked their missing daughter through 20 miles of dangerous territory, and they wanted her back. Tobias checked his weapons. 1 rifle, 2 pistols, maybe 30 rounds total. Against 50 experienced fighters, he might last 5 minutes if he was lucky. But running wasn't an option anymore. The girl couldn't be moved without risking the wound reopening, and even if she could, they'd never outrun war horses across open prairie. The chief called out in broken English, his voice carrying across the morning air like thunder. "White man, you have what belongs to us." Tobias's mouth went dry. How could he explain this? That he'd saved their daughter's life? That he'd risked everything to help her? In their eyes, he was just another settler who'd taken something precious from them. Another white man who couldn't be trusted. He thought about responding, trying to negotiate. But what could he say? That he'd found her bleeding and brought her home? They'd see it as kidnapping. That he'd operated on her wound? They'd call it torture. Behind him, the girl tried to sit up, wincing from the pain. She looked at Tobias with new understanding in her eyes. He hadn't saved her. He'd made himself a target. Now both of them would die because of his misguided compassion. The chief shouted again, louder this time. "Naichi!" The girl's eyes filled with tears at the sound of her name in her father's voice. She tried to call back, but her voice was too weak to carry beyond the cabin walls. Tobias made a decision that would haunt him either way. He stepped toward the door, leaving his weapons behind. 50 arrows tracked his movement. 50 fingers tightened on bowstrings. One wrong move, and he'd be dead before he hit the ground. "She's alive," he called out, hands raised high. "Your daughter is alive, but she's hurt bad." The chief's expression didn't change. If anything, the rage in his eyes intensified. A white man claiming to help his daughter was worse than a white man who'd harmed her. At least enemies were honest about their intentions. "You lie," the chief spat, his English rough but understandable. "Show her to us." That's when Tobias realized his terrible mistake. If he brought Naichi out now, they'd see the crude surgery, the blood-stained bandages, the way she could barely stand. To them, it would look like torture, not treatment. But if he refused to show her, They'd storm the cabin anyway, and the violence would be uncontrollable. Behind him, Naichi was struggling to her feet, determination overriding her pain. She had something to prove to her father, something to say that might save both their lives. The question was, would she defend the man who'd saved her, or would she condemn him to save herself? Naichi stumbled from the cabin, clutching her bandaged shoulder, and spoke 3 words in Apache that made her father's war paint seem to drain of color. "Shilbe Hazani," she said, her voice weak but clear. "He saved me." The chief's painted stallion reared as he processed what his daughter had said. For a moment, the only sounds were wind through prairie grass and leather creaking as 50 warriors shifted in their saddles, uncertain now about their mission of vengeance. The words hung in the air like smoke from a rifle barrel. "He saved me." 3 words that changed everything. But Tobias could see it wasn't over. Not yet. A younger warrior with fresh scalps hanging from his belt was whispering urgently in the chief's ear. His gestures toward Tobias were clear even from a distance. This was still a trick, still a trap. The young warrior's face was twisted with suspicion and rage, and Tobias recognized the look. It was the face of a man who wanted war, who needed war, who'd been waiting for an excuse. Naichi took 3 shaky steps toward her father and collapsed. The fever was consuming her, and the effort of standing had drained what little strength she'd recovered. Tobias instinctively moved to help her, but 20 arrows swung toward his chest with the speed of striking snakes. "Don't," the chief warned in English, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't touch her again." 2 Apache women dismounted and rushed to Naichi. They were older, experienced, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of healers who'd seen countless wounds. They examined her bandages with careful fingers, felt her burning forehead, spoke in rapid, concerned tones to each other. Tobias watched their faces change as they realized the quality of the medical work. The clean stitching, the proper wound care, the fact that she was alive at all when she should have been dead hours ago. The older woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, looked up at the chief and nodded once. A simple gesture, but it carried weight. The girl had been treated well. The white man had told the truth. But the lieutenant wasn't satisfied. He rode closer to Tobias, his horse's hooves stopping just inches from the rancher's boots. Up close, Tobias could see this warrior was maybe 27, with angry scars across his face and hatred burning in his eyes like prairie fire. This wasn't the controlled anger of a protective father. This was something darker, more personal, more dangerous. "She is Chief's daughter," the lieutenant said in broken English, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "You take her, you die. All white men die." Tobias realized with a cold clarity that this wasn't about Naichi anymore. This young warrior wanted war, wanted revenge for something that had happened long before today. The girl's rescue had given him the excuse he'd been looking for, and he wasn't going to let it go easily. The chief was studying Tobias with eyes that had seen 40 years of frontier violence, eyes that had watched the world change, watched his people pushed further and further into corners, watched promises broken and treaties ignored. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why help enemy?" It was the question Tobias had been asking himself since he'd first seen Naichi bleeding behind that cottonwood. Why risk everything for a people who'd killed his wife? Why throw away his life for a stranger? Why choose compassion over safety? "Because she was dying," Tobias said finally, his voice rough from tension and lack of sleep. and I couldn't watch someone die when I could prevent it." The chief's expression shifted slightly. Something in Tobias's words had reached him, had found some common ground between two men who'd both lost too much and seen too much. A father recognizing another man's humanity, perhaps. A warrior recognizing another warrior's honor. But the lieutenant spat in the dirt and raised his rifle, the metal gleaming in the morning sun. "Lies! White man lies!" He turned to the chief, speaking rapid Apache, but his meaning was clear even to Tobias. The accusation hung in the air like poison. "He keeps her for slave, for worse." Tobias saw the doubt creeping back into the chief's eyes, saw the other warriors' faces hardening again, saw the moment slipping away, turning from possible peace back toward inevitable violence. That's when Nietzsche spoke again, louder this time, her voice carrying across the silent ranch despite her weakness. She was still lying on the ground between the two Apache women, but her eyes were open and fierce. She spoke in Apache, long sentences that made the lieutenant's face go white with rage. And then she said something else, something that made her father reach for his tomahawk. The truth exploded across the ranch like lightning splitting a tree. Nietzsche had told her father that the lieutenant, Victor Wade, was the one who'd led her into the army ambush. And now the young warrior was reaching for his knife, his face a mask of panic and fury. Wade had been feeding information to the cavalry, trading Apache lives for army gold. And Nietzsche had witnessed his betrayal 3 days ago when he'd led her and 2 other warriors straight into a patrol's path. She'd seen him flash a mirror signal to the soldiers before they opened fire. She'd watched her companions die while Wade claimed she'd been captured. He'd told the chief that white men had taken his daughter, knowing it would bring the war party here, knowing the army would be waiting. "You speak lies, girl," Wade shouted, but his voice cracked with panic like thin ice under weight. "Fever makes you crazy." 3 other warriors were already moving to surround Wade. Whatever Nietzsche had said was specific enough, detailed enough, that her father believed every word. And Cochise the Younger, called Red Sky by his people, was not a man who tolerated traitors. The chief's face had transformed from anger at Tobias to a cold, deadly rage that made the morning air feel like winter. This was worse than enemy action. This was betrayal from within. This was a cancer that had to be cut out immediately and without mercy. But Wade wasn't finished. Desperate men make desperate choices, and he'd rather die fighting than face Apache justice for treason. His rifle swung toward Nietzsche, intent on silencing the only witness to his betrayal. If she died, it would be her word against his, and the dead can't testify. Tobias moved without thinking. 3 years of grief and guilt exploded into action as he tackled Wade from his horse. They hit the ground hard, a tangle of limbs and fury, rolling through dust and prairie grass, fighting for control of the weapon that could end this either way. The ranch erupted into chaos. Horses reared and screamed. Warriors shouted contradictory orders in Apache and broken English. Some wanted to shoot Tobias for attacking their brother, their fellow warrior. Others wanted to help him stop a traitor who'd gotten their friends killed. The careful discipline of the war party fractured into confusion and noise. Tobias felt Wade's knife slice across his ribs, a line of fire that cut through his shirt and into skin. But adrenaline numbed the pain, turned it into background noise. This was the fight he'd been preparing for since Elizabeth's death. Not against innocent people trying to survive, but against the kind of evil that destroyed everything good in the world for personal gain. They rolled again, and Wade ended up on top, his weight pressing down, his knife hand pushing the blade toward Tobias's throat. The young warrior's face was twisted with rage and desperation, sweat mixing with war paint, creating dark rivers down his cheeks. "You should have minded your own business, white man," Wade hissed, close enough that Tobias could smell the hatred on his breath. Tobias bucked upward with all the strength built from 12 years of mountain living, throwing Wade off balance. His hand found a rock the size of his fist, smooth river stone that had probably been there since before any of them were born. One swing connected with Wade's temple with a sound like an axe hitting wet wood. The knife clattered away across the dirt, and Wade lay still, breathing but unconscious, blood trickling from his head wound onto the earth that had seen too much violence already. Silence settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. 50 warriors stared at the white man who'd just risked his life to protect their chief's daughter from one of their own. The world had turned upside down in the space of a few minutes, and no one was quite sure what came next. The chief dismounted slowly and walked to where Tobias knelt, breathing hard from the fight, blood dripping from his ribs. For a long moment, they looked at each other. Two men who'd lost too much, seen too much, but still recognized honor when they saw it. "You fight to protect my daughter," the chief said simply. It wasn't a question. "I'd do it again," Tobias replied, surprising himself with the truth in those words. The chief nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals, then spoke rapidly in Apache to his warriors. Half of them dismounted, their postures relaxing slightly. The other half began preparing to leave, but not in the way Tobias had expected. Not with violence or threats, but with purpose and organization. Naichi was being helped onto one of the horses despite her protests. She looked back at Tobias with something he hadn't expected to see. Gratitude mixed with genuine sadness, as if she was being torn away from something she'd just discovered and wasn't ready to lose. But the chief wasn't done with his surprises. He pulled something from his belt and held it out to Tobias. It was a medicine bag, decorated with intricate beadwork that had taken months to complete. The leather was soft and worn, clearly old and valuable. "My daughter says you have lost wife to our people," the chief said quietly, his English careful and measured. "This cannot bring her back, but it can protect you from dying before your time comes naturally." Tobias stared at the offering, understanding the weight of what was being given. This wasn't just a gift. It was an adoption into protection. A promise that this band would never raid his land again. A bond between two men who'd found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. But as Tobias reached for the medicine bag, gunshots erupted from the ridge overlooking his ranch. 20 cavalry soldiers appeared on the northern rise with rifles aimed at the Apache below, and their commander was shouting orders to fire at will. The trap had been perfectly planned. Someone had told the army about the Apache war party surrounding Tobias's ranch, and now 50 warriors were caught in the open with nowhere to run. Wade's betrayal ran deeper than anyone had realized. He hadn't just led Naichi into an ambush. He'd set up this entire encounter, knowing the army would be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Take cover!" Tobias shouted, but the Apache were already moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, they'd transformed from a ceremonial gathering into a fighting force, using horses and buildings as shields against the rifle fire raining down from above. The chief grabbed Naichi and pulled her behind Tobias's water trough, just as bullets splintered the wood inches from her head. She was too weak to fight, too fevered to run, and now she was trapped in the middle of a massacre that had been orchestrated by one of her own people. Tobias realized with sick clarity that this was exactly what Wade had planned. Get caught helping an Apache girl, draw the war party to his ranch, signal the cavalry for a surprise attack. Wade would be hailed as a hero for leading the army to a decisive victory, and no one would ever know he'd been playing both sides for profit. But Wade hadn't counted on being exposed as a double agent. Now he was unconscious in the dirt, while his carefully orchestrated betrayal played out around him. An Apache warrior cried out as a bullet found his shoulder. Another's horse screamed and collapsed, pinning its rider's leg beneath its weight. The cavalry had the high ground and superior firepower, muzzle flashes lighting up the ridge like deadly fireflies. But the Apache had something more valuable than position or weapons. They had nothing left to lose. "Thornfield!" The cavalry commander's voice carried over the gunfire, sharp and authoritative. "Step away from the hostiles. We're here to rescue you." Tobias looked at the Apache warriors around him, men who'd been ready to kill him an hour ago, but were now fighting to protect his property from destruction. The chief caught his eye and nodded toward the house, a gesture that somehow communicated volumes. "Go," the chief said simply, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "This is not your war." But Tobias was already moving toward his cabin, not to surrender or to hide, but to retrieve his rifle and ammunition. Every box of cartridges he owned, every weapon he could carry. The army thought they were rescuing him. They were about to learn that some rescues weren't wanted. He burst through his front door and grabbed his Winchester, along with 3 boxes of ammunition. Through his window, he could see the Apache taking defensive positions around his barn and outbuildings, turning his ranch into a fortress with the same tactical precision they'd shown surrounding it earlier. When Tobias emerged with his rifle, several warriors stared in disbelief. The chief's eyes widened as he understood what the white man intended to do. "You choose to fight with us?" the chief asked, genuine shock breaking through his stoic expression. "I choose to fight for what's right," Tobias replied, taking aim at the ridge. "And right now, that means fighting with you." If you were Tobias, what would you do? Join the army that's supposed to be on your side, or defend the people who came to kill you but showed you honor? Sometimes right and wrong are as clear as day and night. Today, the army was wrong. Tobias's first shot dropped the cavalry sergeant leading the charge, and suddenly 20 soldiers were firing at the man they'd come to rescue. The irony wasn't lost on him as bullets shattered his cabin windows and splintered his porch railings. By choosing to stand with the Apache, he'd made himself a target of his own people, an enemy of the nation he'd been born into. But watching the chief fight to protect Naichi with the same desperation he'd once felt trying to save Elizabeth, Tobias knew he'd made the right choice. Some lines were clearer than others, and today, the line between right and wrong ran right through the middle of his ranch. The Apache were outnumbered and outgunned, facing modern rifles with bows and aging weapons. But they fought with the precision of men who'd been warriors since childhood, who'd learned tactics at their father's sides, who knew that every arrow had to count because there might not be another one. They used every piece of cover his property offered, made every shot meaningful, turned Tobias's ranch into a killing field for anyone foolish enough to charge across open ground without thinking. The cavalry commander, a young officer named Harrison with more ambition than experience, kept ordering frontal assaults that cost him men without gaining ground. His face grew redder with each failed charge, his voice more shrill, his decisions more desperate. After the third wave broke against Apache arrows and Tobias's rifle, his remaining soldiers were getting reluctant to follow orders that seemed designed to get them killed rather than win a battle. But Wade was waking up, his head wound bleeding but his betrayal still intact. He crawled toward a fallen soldier's rifle, his movements slow and pained but purposeful. His intention was clear. Shoot Naichi while everyone was distracted by the battle. Silence the witness permanently. Dead girls tell no tale. Tobias saw the movement from the corner of his eye and swung his rifle around, but he was too far away, his angle wrong. Wade's weapon was already rising toward the water trough where the chief's daughter lay hidden, where she was protected by nothing but old wood and her father's body. That's when one of the Apache warriors made a choice that shocked everyone on that blood-soaked ranch. Instead of shooting at the cavalry, instead of defending against the actual attack, a young warrior named Kele put an arrow through Wade's chest. Through his own band member, through his friend and hunting companion. The arrow flew straight and true, and Wade fell back with a look of surprise frozen on his face, permanently ending the traitors' war. The chief looked at Kele, at the warrior who'd just killed his own friend to protect the truth and honor of their people, and nodded grimly. Justice had been served in the middle of chaos, delivered by a young man who'd chosen what was right over what was easy. Kele stood there with tears streaming down his face, his bow still raised, his whole body shaking. Wade had been his friend. They'd hunted together, shared stories around fires, laughed at the same jokes. But Wade had also gotten Kele's brother killed in that ambush 3 days ago. And honor, true honor, had to stand above friendship, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The battle was turning. The cavalry had lost 7 men to the Apache's 2, and their ammunition was running low. But the Apache were almost out of arrows, and several warriors were wounded badly enough that they could barely hold their weapons. Both sides were exhausted, bleeding, running on nothing but pride and stubbornness. Tobias was down to his last box of cartridges when he heard something that changed everything. More horses approaching from the east, the thunder of hooves on hard ground. At first, he thought it was cavalry reinforcements, which would mean certain death for everyone defending the ranch. But these weren't soldiers. These were ranchers from the surrounding territory, drawn by the sound of sustained gunfire that had been echoing across the valley for nearly an hour. Men who knew Tobias McCrae as an honest neighbor, a man who'd helped them through hard winters and shared water during droughts, who'd never asked for payment or expected anything in return. The cavalry commander tried to wave them off, shouting that he was conducting a military operation against hostile Indians. But the ranchers had eyes that worked just fine. They could see Tobias fighting alongside the Apache, could see the girl who was clearly wounded and being protected rather than held captive, could see that something about this whole situation didn't smell right. Old Ezra Blackwood, who owned the spread 5 miles south, rode up to the cavalry commander with his own rifle ready. Ezra was 51 years old, tall and lean, with a white beard and hands that had worked leather and rope for 3 decades. He had the kind of voice that carried authority without needing to shout. "What in hell are you doing, soldier boy?" Ezra demanded. "That's Tobias Thornfield down there, and he's no Indian fighter unless someone gives him cause to be." The commander's authority was crumbling like dry clay. His men were demoralized. His mission was exposed as something darker than a rescue, and now he had armed civilians questioning his orders. But wounded men with nothing to lose make dangerous enemies, and Captain Harrison was both wounded in pride and running out of options. The commander's hand moved to his sidearm, and Tobias realized with cold certainty that the officer was prepared to shoot his way out of this situation rather than face a court-martial for attacking innocent ranchers and conducting an unauthorized assault. The chief saw it too. Their eyes met across the battlefield, and they both understood what was about to happen. Both recognized the moment when a desperate man decides to take others down with him, rather than face the consequences of his actions. The cavalry commander drew his pistol on Ezra Blackwood, the metal clearing leather with deadly intent. But the chief's tomahawk found Harrison's skull before the shot could fire, the ancient weapon proving faster than the modern one. The blade sank deep with a sound that silenced every gun on that ranch. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. The remaining soldiers, demoralized and leaderless, threw down their weapons when faced with 20 angry ranchers who'd known Tobias Thornfield for years. These weren't career soldiers hardened by a decade of frontier warfare. They were farm boys and drifters who joined the army for steady pay, not to massacre civilians on a California ranch under orders from a corrupt officer. Ezra Blackwood dismounted and walked over to where Tobias knelt beside the water trough, checking on Naichi's condition. The girl's fever had broken during the fighting, her body finally winning its battle against infection and trauma. Her eyes were clearer now, more focused, though she was still weak from blood loss and exhaustion. "Toby," Ezra said quietly, using the nickname only old friends were allowed. "You want to tell me what this is all about?" So Tobias told the story. Finding Naichi wounded and dying behind that fallen pine, treating her injuries while knowing it could cost him everything. The arrival of the war party, Wade's betrayal that ran deeper than anyone imagined, the Army's attack on what should have been a peaceful resolution. He told it simply, without embellishment, the way mountain men tell stories around fires when the truth is dramatic enough on its own. The other ranchers listened in silence, their weathered faces showing understanding that came from living on the same harsh frontier. They knew what it cost to make the choices Tobias had made. They knew that their neighbor had risked everything to save a life, and that kind of courage deserved respect, regardless of whose life it was. The chief approached slowly, his war paint streaked with sweat and gunpowder, his chest heaving from exertion. He looked at the dead cavalry commander lying in the dirt with a tomahawk buried in his skull. Then at the soldiers sitting with their hands raised, young faces pale with shock. Then at the ranchers who'd intervened to stop a massacre. "This white man," the chief said, pointing at Tobias with a hand still stained with Harrison's blood, "has more honor than soldiers who wear blue coats." Ezra nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the chief to Tobias to the wounded girl. "Toby's always been decent folk. If he says the girl needed help, then she needed help." But the situation was far from resolved, and everyone standing in that blood-soaked dirt knew it. 23 soldiers were dead or wounded. An army captain was scalped on civilian property. An Apache war party was standing in the middle of white ranchers' territory with weapons still in their hands. This was the kind of incident that started wars between entire peoples, that gave politicians in Washington the excuse they'd been looking for, to send more troops west and push the tribes onto smaller and smaller parcels of worthless land. The chief seemed to understand this too, his experienced eyes reading the situation with the clarity of a man who'd survived 4 decades of frontier politics. He spoke rapidly to his warriors in Apache, and they began preparing to leave despite their own wounded. Better to retreat now than wait for more soldiers to arrive, seeking vengeance for their fallen commander. "Wait," Tobias said, his voice cutting through the organized chaos of departure. He looked at Naichi, who was now strong enough to sit up on her own, but still pale and shaking. "She's not ready to travel. The wound could reopen. She could bleed out before you make it 10 miles. The chief's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the war paint. Every minute they stayed increased the danger, invited more conflict, risked more lives. But his daughter's life was worth more than tactical advantage. It had always been worth more. "We take that risk," the chief decided, his voice final. But Naichi had something to say about her own fate. She struggled to her feet, using the water trough for support, and spoke in Apache. Her voice carried the authority of a chief's daughter, despite her youth and weakness, demanding to be heard the way her mother had taught her. Whatever she said made her father's eyes widen with surprise and something else. Pride, maybe. Or recognition that his little girl had grown into a woman who could make her own decisions. She was refusing to leave. She was claiming sanctuary at Tobias's ranch under Apache law, putting herself under his protection until she was fully healed. It was an old tradition, one that went back generations, and once claimed it had to be honored. The chief looked at Tobias with an expression that mixed respect with deep concern. "She chooses to trust you with her life," he said slowly, making sure Tobias understood the weight of what was being offered. "If anything happens to her—" He didn't need to finish the threat. They both knew what it meant. But he also handed Tobias the medicine bag he'd offered earlier, sealing a bond that would change both their lives forever. The beadwork was intricate and beautiful, the leather soft from years of handling. It had belonged to Naichi's mother, a medicine woman named Saba, who died 2 years earlier from the cholera that white settlers had brought west in their wagon trains. That's when they heard the sound of more cavalry approaching from 3 different directions, the drumming of hooves like distant thunder promising a storm. The approaching cavalry turned out to be Colonel James Crook from Fort Griffin, riding with 2 full companies and a white flag snapping in the wind above his standard-bearer. He'd come to negotiate, not to fight. Crook was old Army, 54 years of service written in the lines of his face and the gray of his close-cropped beard. A man who'd seen enough frontier violence to know the difference between justice and massacre, between soldiers following orders and civilians defending their homes. When he surveyed the scene at Tobias's ranch, taking in the dead soldiers and the Apache warriors and the ranchers standing together like some strange alliance, he understood immediately that something had gone very wrong with his subordinate's mission. His eyes, pale gray and sharp as winter ice, missed nothing. "Commander Harrison was ordered to investigate reports of a kidnapping," Colonel Crook said carefully, his voice carrying the measured tones of a man choosing his words with political precision. "Not to engage in open warfare against civilians." Ezra Blackwood spat tobacco juice in the dirt, a gesture of contempt that needed no translation. "Your boy Harrison was fixing to shoot me for asking questions, Colonel. If that chief hadn't put a tomahawk in his skull, we'd be burying white folks too." The colonel's experienced eyes took in the scene with the methodical assessment of a man who'd spent 3 decades reading battlefields. Naichi's medical bandages, clean and professional. The quality of treatment she'd received, evident in her survival. The way the Apache warriors were protecting her rather than threatening anyone. This wasn't a kidnapping. This was a rescue that had turned into a political nightmare because of one corrupt officer's ambition and one traitor's greed. But Crook had survived 30 years of frontier politics by finding solutions that satisfied everyone's honor without starting wars. He looked at the chief, then at Tobias, then at the medicine bag hanging from the rancher's belt. The symbols were there for anyone who knew how to read them. "It appears there's been a misunderstanding," he said diplomatically, his tone suggesting he knew exactly what had happened, but was offering everyone a way to save face. "The Army received information that a white settler was holding an Apache girl against her will. Clearly, that information was incorrect." The chief nodded slowly, recognizing the olive branch being extended. "White man saved my daughter's life when Army bullet would have killed her. We came to honor this act, not to make war." "And yet 23 soldiers are dead," Crook observed, his voice carefully neutral. The statement hung in the air, a reminder that consequences existed regardless of intentions. "Because they attacked while we spoke of peace," the chief replied, his English more fluid now, shaped by the urgency of the moment. "Your commander fired first." Crook could see the political calculation in the chief's words, could understand what was being offered. Both sides needed a way to end this without losing face or starting a broader conflict that would consume the entire territory. The truth was messy and complicated, full of betrayals and mistakes and violence. But the solution could be simple if both men were willing to accept it. "I propose this," Crook said, his voice taking on the formal tone of official pronouncements. "The Army officially records that Commander Harrison exceeded his authority and attacked peaceful negotiations. The Apache returned to their territory with our apologies for the misunderstanding. Mr. Thornfield continues his life as a respected member of this community." It was a face-saving lie that everyone could live with. The dead soldiers would be honored as victims of their commander's poor judgment, rather than heroes of a righteous cause. Harrison would take all the blame, conveniently unable to defend himself from his grave. And two peoples who'd been at war for generations would have a reason to step back from the edge, at least for now. But Naichi still refused to leave until her wound fully healed. For 2 weeks, she stayed at Tobias's ranch under the protection of both Apache law and Army guarantee. Colonel Crook himself signed papers making it official, turning Tobias's isolated cabin into neutral ground where neither side could take aggressive action without breaking their word. During those 2 weeks, something unexpected happened. Something that couldn't have been planned or predicted or forced. Naichi began teaching Tobias her language, the flowing syllables of Apache that sounded like water over stones. And he taught her to read English, starting with simple words and building toward full sentences, watching her mind absorb knowledge like desert sand absorbing rain. They shared stories about their peoples, their losses, their hopes for a future where understanding might replace violence. Tobias told her about Elizabeth, about how his wife had believed in healing rather than revenge, in building bridges rather than burning them. Naichi told him about her mother, Saba, a medicine woman who'd dreamed of a day when Apache and whites could share knowledge instead of bullets. In the evenings, they cooked together, combining Apache recipes with frontier cooking in ways that sometimes worked and sometimes ended in laughter over burned food and too much spice. Tobias tried to teach Naichi traditional dancing from back east, movements he barely remembered from his youth, and she tried to teach him ceremonial Apache dances. Both attempts ended in laughter, his massive frame too awkward for graceful movement, her injuries too fresh for the stamina required. "I'm built for wrestling bears, not dancing," Tobias said one evening after tripping over his own feet for the 3rd time. "Yes," Naichi replied with the hint of a smile. "That is why they call you Bear." The humor was gentle, the kind that builds between people who've faced death together and come out the other side, between teacher and student, between two lonely people who'd found unexpected friendship in the wreckage of violence. On the 8th day, they sat by the fire as evening settled over the mountains, and Naichi asked about Elizabeth, how they'd met, what she was like, how she'd died. Tobias found himself talking about things he hadn't spoken of in 3 years. The guilt he carried for not being there when the raid happened, the way grief had hollowed him out and left him half a man, going through the motions of living without really being alive. And Naichi told him about Saba, about watching her mother die from disease while being unable to help, about the determination to continue her mother's work of healing. They discovered that grief didn't need language. It was the common tongue of hearts that had lost too much, and in sharing it, they found a kind of peace. "Grief knows no language," Nietzsche said in careful English, practicing the words Tobias had taught her. "It is language of all hearts that lose." By the 14th day, Tobias was teaching Nietzsche to shoot a rifle, and she was teaching him Apache tracking methods. She had natural aim, the kind that couldn't be taught, and he was impressed by tracking techniques that were different from frontier methods, but just as effective. The mutual respect that had started with gratitude was growing into genuine friendship. On the night of the 14th day, Nietzsche asked the question that had been hanging between them like smoke. "What happened after I leave? We forget each other?" Tobias looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and thinking about the past 2 weeks. "I won't forget you, little warrior. You changed something in me. Reminded me the world's not all hate." "You changed me too," Nietzsche said softly. "Showed me white man can have honor." The silence that followed was comfortable, full of understanding that went deeper than words. They both knew this bond was permanent, that something had been forged between them that distance and time couldn't break. Ezra arrived on the 15th day with supplies and news. He brought flour and sugar and coffee and ammunition, the practical gifts of frontier life. But he also brought darker news that cast shadows over the peaceful interlude. "Some folks in town not happy about this," Ezra said, keeping his voice low so Nietzsche wouldn't hear. "Say you're going native. Can't be trusted. Army higher-ups asking questions about Harrison's death. Colonel Crook's holding the line, but pressure's building." "Let them talk," Tobias said. "I did the right thing." "I know," Ezra replied, "but right don't always mean safe." After Ezra left, Nietzsche worried that she was bringing danger to Tobias, that her presence was causing him problems he didn't need. But Tobias waved away her concerns with the kind of stubborn determination that had kept him alive in the mountains for 12 years. "You brought purpose," he said. "First time in 3 years, I felt useful." On the 17th day, Grandmother Stone arrived unannounced, appearing at the cabin door like a spirit from the old stories. She was 72 years old, small and bent with age, but her eyes were sharp as a hawk's and missed nothing. She'd been Saba's teacher, and before that, she'd been a medicine woman when the Apache controlled half of California. She examined Nietzsche thoroughly, checking the wound with expert fingers that had treated thousands of injuries over a lifetime of healing. The scar was clean, properly closed, healing well. Nietzsche was ready to travel from a medical standpoint. "But are you ready to leave?" Grandmother Stone asked in Apache, her voice carrying layers of meaning. Nietzsche was silent, torn between duty to her people and desire to stay and learn more, to absorb more knowledge, to build this bridge between worlds. Grandmother Stone's private talk with Nietzsche was in Apache, but Tobias could see the wisdom being passed from one generation to another, could see Nietzsche's face change as she understood what was being asked of her. "I see what you want," Grandmother Stone said. "Bridge between peoples. But bridge must have 2 sides. You are Apache side. Learn here, then go home. Teach our people. Make Mother's dream real." A bridge must have 2 sides. You cannot be bridge if you stand only on one side. The wisdom settled over Nietzsche like a blanket, giving her clarity about her path forward. Later, Grandmother Stone spoke with Tobias while Nietzsche prepared their evening meal. "You gave her tools, words, knowledge, hope, the old woman said in careful English, but also gave her father figure after loss. She gave me reason after loss, Tobias replied. You both heal each other, Grandmother Stone said. That is sacred. The final night, they cooked a special meal together, combining the best of both traditions. Apache herbs and spices mixed with frontier cooking methods, creating something new that belonged to neither culture and both. Naichi read aloud from one of Elizabeth's old books, her pronunciation careful and precise, while Tobias listened with pride swelling in his chest. They exchanged gifts. Tobias gave her books wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather, volumes on medicine and history and stories that she could take back to her people. Naichi gave him a woven bracelet she'd made secretly during her recovery, using techniques her mother had taught her. You are family now, she said. Distance cannot change this. Neither wanted morning to come. Both knew it must. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, understanding passing between them that was deeper than any words could express. Cochise arrived at dawn with a small group of 10 warriors, approaching peacefully with no weapons drawn. He saw Naichi, healthy and smiling, and changed in ways that went beyond physical healing. Relief and pride mixed on his weathered face as he recognized that his daughter had found something precious in this strange sanctuary. Naichi demonstrated her reading, choosing a passage about medicine from one of the textbooks and reading it aloud in English. Then she wrote words on paper, her handwriting careful and clear. Cochise was shocked, understanding dawning in his eyes. This was power. Knowledge was power. The kind of power that could help his people survive in a changing world. Kept my promise, Tobias said, returning the medicine bag. She's safe and healthy. She doesn't need protection anymore. She is protection. But Cochise refused to take the bag back, closing Tobias's fingers around it with both hands. No, you keep. You are family now. This marks it forever. Naichi spoke to her father then, her voice carrying conviction that came from weeks of learning and thinking and planning. She wanted to continue learning. She wanted to bring white teachers to the reservation. She wanted to teach Apache children to read and write, not to become white, but to survive a changing world. It was revolutionary, the kind of idea that could transform a people or tear them apart. Cochise considered it carefully, understanding the weight of what his daughter was proposing. Then he looked at Tobias. You would help? The chief asked. Come to reservation? Teach? I'm no teacher, Tobias said honestly. I'm a mountain man who barely finished school himself. But for Naichi, for her dream, I'll try. Come every few months. Teach what I can. Cochise extended his arm, and Tobias clasped it in the warrior's grip. We are allies. More than allies. We are family. Promises don't need papers when men of honor stand before each other. The bond was sealed not with ink, but with respect, earned through blood and fire. Naichi mounted her horse, taking one last look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary and her school. She waved to Tobias, her eyes bright with tears and hope and determination. See you soon, Father Bear, she said, the nickname carrying affection that transcended culture and language. Soon, little warrior, Tobias replied, his throat tight with emotion he hadn't felt since Elizabeth died. The Apache departed slowly, not with the urgency of that first morning, but with the measured pace of people who knew they'd be back. Tobias stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared into the mountains, until the last horse was just a dark speck against the green slopes. The cabin felt empty after they left, but it was a different kind of empty than the 3 years before Naichi. This was the empty of something completed, not something lost. This was the pause between chapters, not the end of the book. Tobias walked inside and picked up one of the primers Nietzsche had practiced with, running his fingers over the pages she'd read. 2 weeks had changed everything. The question now was what he would build with that change. The medicine bag hung at his belt, warm against his side, a promise given, a promise that would be kept. While Colonel Crook's men set up a perimeter around the property, Tobias worked with the 2 Apache healers to treat the wounded on both sides. The scene was surreal in its civility. White ranchers sharing water with Apache warriors. Cavalry soldiers sitting silent and ashamed beside the men they'd been trying to kill an hour ago. The dead lay where they'd fallen, waiting for proper burial, their presence a sobering reminder of how close they'd all come to complete catastrophe. Ezra Blackwood gathered the other ranchers near Tobias's cabin, and they spoke in low voices about what they'd witnessed. These were practical men, not given to flights of fancy or political theorizing, but they understood what they'd seen. Their neighbor had risked everything to save a life, and that kind of moral courage deserved support, regardless of the complications it created. "We stand with you, Toby," Ezra said when Tobias approached. "All of us. Anyone gives you trouble over this, they answer to the whole valley." The other ranchers nodded, their faces weathered and serious. Old Pete Murdoch, who'd lost a son to Apache raids 5 years back, stepped forward. "What you did took guts. More guts than shooting from cover. The girl needed help, you gave it. That's the end of it, far as I'm concerned." It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. These men knew loss as intimately as Tobias did. If they could see past their own grief to recognize honor when they saw it, perhaps there was hope for something better than endless cycles of revenge. Among the Apache warriors, a similar conversation was taking place. Kale sat apart from the others, his bow across his knees, his face a mask of controlled grief. He'd killed Wade with his own hands, ended the life of a man he'd called friend and brother. The other warriors gave him space, understanding that some burdens couldn't be shared. Cochise approached Kale and sat beside him in silence for several minutes before speaking in Apache. "You chose the harder path, the path of honor over the path of easy friendship. Your brother's spirit can rest now, knowing justice was done by his own blood." "He was my friend," Kale said, his voice hollow. "We hunted together since we were boys, and he betrayed that friendship when he sold our people for white man's gold," Cochise replied. "You did not kill a friend today. You killed a traitor who wore a friend's face. There is a difference, and your heart will learn it in time." Nietzsche watched this exchange from where she sat, wrapped in blankets, her shoulder throbbing, but her mind clear. The fever had finally broken completely, leaving her weak but aware. She saw the way her father looked at Tobias, the way the white ranchers stood in solidarity with their neighbor, the way even young Kale was being supported by his community, despite the terrible choice he'd made. This was what her mother had envisioned. Not perfect harmony, not the erasure of differences or pain, but the possibility of choosing honor over hatred. The possibility of seeing past skin and language to recognize the common humanity beneath. Grandmother Stone arrived as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The old medicine woman had traveled from the reservation as soon as word reached her of the battle, moving with surprising speed despite her 72 years. She went first to Nietzsche, examining her wound with expert fingers and pronouncing herself satisfied with Tobias's work. "The white bear knows healing," she said in Apache, loud enough for the nearby warriors to hear. "His hands were guided by love, not by harm. This girl lives because he chose life over death, compassion over revenge." Then she turned to Tobias and spoke in careful English. "You have done sacred work, Bear Man. You have shown that the old ways and new ways can walk together. Grandmother Stone touched Nietzsche's head gently, then looked at Tobias. When we teach our children to read white man's words, we do not lose our songs. When we learn white man's medicine, we do not forget the herbs our grandmothers taught us. Knowledge is a river that grows wider by accepting new streams, not narrower by refusing them. She paused, her ancient eyes studying him. My student, Saba, who walks with spirits now, would call you brother. Tobias felt the weight of those words settle over him like the medicine bag at his belt. To be called brother by the teacher of the woman whose death had started this chain of events carried meaning that transcended language. Colonel Crook gathered everyone within earshot and made his formal pronouncement, ensuring both Apache and white witnesses heard the official version that would be recorded in Army reports and territorial records. Commander Harrison had exceeded his authority. The Apache had acted in self-defense during peaceful negotiations. Tobias Thornfield was a civilian who'd defended his property within his rights. The matter was closed. It was a political fiction that served a deeper truth, and everyone present understood the bargain being struck. The alternative was war that would consume the entire territory, that would see children orphaned and communities destroyed on both sides. Sometimes the truth had to be shaped slightly to serve justice. But Nietzsche's sanctuary claim created a new complication that Crook addressed with diplomatic precision. Mr. Thornfield, you're willing to accept responsibility for Miss Nietzsche's safety during her recovery. I am, Tobias said simply. And Chief Cochise, you trust this arrangement under Apache law? Cochise stood tall, his war paint now streaked and faded, but his bearing still regal. I trust the man who saved my daughter's life. I trust the man who fought beside my warriors against his own people when those people were wrong. I trust the bear who walks between worlds. Crook nodded and pulled out a document he'd prepared during the ride from Fort Griffin, having anticipated this possibility. Then let it be recorded that Tobias McCrae's property is declared neutral ground under joint Apache and United States authority. For the duration of Miss Nietzsche's recovery, no military or civilian action may be taken here without violating treaty. Any violation will be considered an act of war. He signed the document with a flourish, then passed it to Cochise, who made his mark beside the colonel's signature. Tobias added his own signature, his hand shaking slightly as he understood what this meant. His isolated cabin had just become the first official neutral ground in California territory, a place where two peoples at war could meet without weapons. As preparations were made for departure, Cochise drew Tobias aside for the conversation about his daughter's dreams and his own concerns. The medicine bag changed hands not once, but twice in this telling. First offered back by Tobias, and then firmly returned by Cochise, with words that made the adoption into Apache protection permanent and binding. While you wear this, Cochise said, pressing the beaded leather into Tobias's palm and closing his fingers around it. You are family. Not adopted family, not honorary family, but family in truth. Cochise paused, then added in Apache before translating to English. The strongest bonds are not those we are born into, but those we choose to honor. Blood can betray, but honor never does. My daughter's safety is your responsibility. Your safety is my responsibility. We are bound now, Bear McCrae, bound by honor and blood and sacred trust. The warriors began their departure as shadows lengthened across the valley. They would camp 5 miles away and return in 2 weeks to collect Nietzsche, giving her time to heal properly. The ranchers dispersed to their own properties, spreading word of what had happened and ensuring that Tobias's version of events became the accepted truth before rumors could take root. Colonel Crook was the last to leave, pausing at the edge of the property to offer Tobias a final piece of advice. You've started something here that's bigger than you understand. Use it wisely. Bridge builders are rare in this world, and they're usually killed by one side or the other for their trouble. Don't let that be your fate. I'll do my best, Tobias replied. See that you do. The territory needs more men like you and fewer like Harrison. We've got enough people willing to fight. We need more willing to think. As the last horse disappeared over the ridge, Tobias and Nietzsche stood together in the sudden quiet, surveying the damage to the cabin and the blood-stained earth that would need to be cleaned and consecrated before it could be home again. 2 weeks, Nietzsche said softly in English, each word carefully pronounced. Then I go home. 2 weeks, Tobias agreed. We'll make them count. Neither of them knew it yet, but those 2 weeks would transform both their lives and set in motion changes that would ripple across generations. The bridge had been proposed. Now it was time to build it properly, one careful plank at a time. The medicine bag hung heavy at Tobias's belt, a reminder that some promises transcend politics and violence. That family can be chosen as well as born. That honor, true honor, knows no boundary of skin or language. The sun set over the Sierra Nevada, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time since Elizabeth's death, Tobias McCrae felt something that might become hope if he nurtured it carefully enough. The 2 weeks that followed transformed Tobias McCrae's isolated cabin into something it had never been before. A schoolhouse, a sanctuary, a bridge between 2 worlds that had been at war for as long as anyone could remember. The first 3 days focused on physical healing, on making sure Nietzsche's wound closed properly without infection, without the fever returning to burn through her small frame and undo all the work Tobias had done to save her life. He changed her bandages twice daily with the careful precision Elizabeth had taught him, checking for signs of corruption, for the red streaks that meant poison was spreading through the blood. But he also taught her the English names for the herbs he used: yarrow for bleeding, comfrey for wounds, willow bark for pain and fever. Nietzsche repeated each word carefully, her pronunciation improving with each attempt, her quick mind cataloging the knowledge like a merchant counting precious coins. And she taught him Apache medicine techniques that his wife had never known, methods passed down through generations of healers who'd learned from the land itself. How to make poultices that drew out infection faster than anything in Elizabeth's old medical books. Which plants grew where and when, following patterns that white doctors had never bothered to learn. The songs that medicine women sang while working, not because the songs had magic, but because rhythm helped focus the mind and steady the hands. "You know Elizabeth's ways," Nietzsche said on the 4th day, her English improving with startling speed. "I know Mother's ways. Together, we know more than either alone." It was a simple observation, but it carried weight that extended far beyond medicine. By the 4th day, the wound was healing clean, and Nietzsche was strong enough to move around the cabin without wincing. That's when the real education began, when sanctuary became something more than just safety from violence. Nietzsche taught Tobias basic Apache language, starting with greetings and thanks, and important phrases that might save his life someday if he found himself among her people. Tobias struggled with the pronunciation, his mouth not shaped for sounds that flowed like water over stones. Nietzsche laughed at his attempts, genuine laughter that filled the cabin with a warmth it hadn't known in 3 years. "You sound like a bear trying to sing," she said, and the nickname stuck. Tobias taught Nietzsche to read English, starting with simple words from Elizabeth's old primers and building toward full sentences. He used the Bible for some lessons, not for religious instruction, but because it was the only book he had multiple copies of, the only text thick enough to provide variety. He used medical texts for other lessons, Knowing Naichi's interest in healing would keep her engaged. She learned with a hunger that amazed him. Words she saw once, she remembered. Concepts that took most children weeks to grasp, she absorbed in days. By the end of the first week, she was reading simple paragraphs, sounding out unfamiliar words with determination that reminded Tobias of her mother, the medicine woman who'd dreamed of bridges between peoples. They cooked together in the evenings, combining Apache recipes with frontier cooking methods in ways that sometimes worked beautifully and sometimes ended in laughter over burned food and too much spice. Naichi showed him how to prepare pemmican properly, mixing dried meat with fat and berries in proportions that would keep for months. Tobias showed her how to make sourdough bread, the starter he'd been keeping alive for 8 years, feeding it weekly like a pet that never died. In Apache we have saying, Naichi told him one evening, while they worked side by side at the rough wooden table. Guest and host eat together. They become family. Not blood family, but choice family. Sometimes stronger. We've got a saying, too, Tobias replied, his hands kneading dough, while hers ground dried berries. Break bread together often enough, and enemies become friends. On the 8th day, they sat by the fire as evening settled over the mountains like a blanket, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Tobias of why he'd fallen in love with this harsh land in the first place. The silence between them was comfortable now, the kind that exists between people who've moved past the need to fill every moment with words. Naichi broke it with a question that had clearly been building for days. Tell me about Elizabeth. How you meet. What's she like? So Tobias told her, the words coming easier than they had in 3 years of solitude. How Elizabeth had been a nurse in Sacramento when he'd come in with a knife wound from a hunting accident. How she'd patched him up while lecturing him about being more careful, her hands gentle, but her words sharp. How he'd come back the next day with flowers and an apology, and she'd laughed at both. He told Naichi about their 12 years together, about how Elizabeth had insisted on coming with him to the frontier, despite knowing the dangers, despite her family's objections. About how she'd set up a small clinic in the settlement, treating anyone who came, regardless of whether they could pay. About how she'd learned medicine from books, but wisdom from experience, and taught him both. And he told her about the raid, about coming home from a hunting trip to find the settlement burned and Elizabeth among the dead, about the guilt he'd carried ever since, the feeling that if he'd just been there, maybe he could have saved her. Maybe his presence would have changed the outcome somehow. You carry weight that is not yours to carry, Naichi said softly when he finished. Apache have saying for this too. The dead do not blame the living for living. Your wife, she would not want you to stop being alive because she died. It was wisdom beyond her 17 years, and Tobias suspected it came from her own experience with loss. Tell me about your mother, he said, about Saba. Naichi's face changed, grief and pride mixing in expressions that shifted like clouds. She told him about Saba, the medicine woman who'd been teaching her the healing arts since she was old enough to walk. About how her mother had believed that Apache and whites could share knowledge instead of just bullets and hatred. About the cholera epidemic 2 years ago, brought by white settlers, but killing indiscriminately, and how Saba had worked herself to exhaustion, trying to save both Apache and white victims before the disease claimed her, too. She die helping white family, Naichi said, her voice steady, but her eyes wet. Father was angry. Say she should help only Apache. But mother say, sickness does not see skin color. Neither should healer. Your mother and my wife would have been friends, Tobias said. Yes, Nietzsche agreed. That is why we friends now. We carry their dreams. The silence that followed was heavy with shared grief and shared understanding. Two people who'd lost the ones who shaped them, finding connection in that loss rather than letting it drive them apart. Grief knows no language. It is the common tongue of all hearts that have lost what they cannot replace. And in sharing it, sometimes the burden becomes lighter. By the 10th day, the lessons had evolved beyond language and medicine. Tobias taught Nietzsche to shoot a rifle, starting with basic safety and building toward actual marksmanship. She had natural aim, the kind that couldn't be taught, and within hours she was hitting targets that would have taken most people weeks to master. "Your father teach you to shoot bow?" Tobias asked, watching her reload with practiced efficiency. "Since I was 6 summers," Nietzsche replied, taking aim at a pine knot 30 yards away. "Father say, Apache woman must protect herself. World does not care if you are girl or boy when danger comes." The shot rang out, and the pine knot exploded into splinters. In return, Nietzsche taught Tobias Apache tracking methods, showing him how to read signs in the dirt that he'd been walking past for 12 years without seeing. How to tell the age of tracks by the sharpness of their edges. How to determine the mood of the animal or person who made them by their depth and spacing. How to move through brush without leaving traces, stepping on rocks and hard ground rather than soft earth. "You are good for white man," she said on the 11th day, watching him practice the techniques she'd taught. But Apache child of 8 summers would track better. "Well, I'm a little old to be starting over," Tobias replied with dry humor. "But I appreciate you not lying about my skills." They both laughed, and Tobias realized it was the first time he'd genuinely laughed since Elizabeth died. On the 14th night, Nietzsche asked the question that had been hanging between them like smoke from the fire, unspoken but present in every interaction. "What happened after I leave? We forget each other? Go back to being enemies?" Tobias stared into the flames, watching them dance and shift, seeing patterns that meant nothing, but feeling like they should mean something. He thought about the past 2 weeks, about how this wounded girl had walked into his life and reminded him that he was more than just grief and solitude, that he still had something to offer the world, even if it was just teaching one person to read or helping one person heal. "I won't forget you, little warrior," he said finally, using the nickname that had emerged naturally over their time together. "You changed something in me that I thought was dead, reminded me the world's not all hate and violence, that there's still room for kindness, for learning, for building instead of just tearing down." "You changed me too," Nietzsche said, her voice soft but certain. "Showed me that white man can have honor, that not all of you are like soldiers who shoot first and ask questions never, that maybe mother's dream was not foolish. Maybe whites and Apache can share more than just battlefield." The silence that followed was full of understanding that went deeper than words could express. They both knew this bond was permanent, that something had been forged between them in blood and effort and shared learning that distance and time couldn't break. On the 15th day, Ezra Blackwood arrived with his weekly supply run, bringing flour and sugar and coffee and ammunition, the practical gifts that kept frontier life running. But he also brought news that cast shadows over the peaceful interlude they'd created. "Some folks in town are not happy about this arrangement," Ezra said, keeping his voice low so Nietzsche wouldn't hear from where she was reading by the window. "Saying you've gone native, can't be trusted anymore." There's talk of having the territorial governor investigate, maybe send federal marshals to check on the situation. Let them talk, Tobias said, his jaw set with the stubborn determination that had kept him alive through 12 mountain winters. I did the right thing, and I'd do it again. I know you did, Ezra replied, and most of the ranchers around here know it too. We've put out the word that anyone who causes you trouble will answer to all of us. But the Army higher-ups are still asking questions about Harrison's death, and Colonel Crook can only hold them off for so long. Political pressure is building. After Ezra left, Naichi came to Tobias with worry written across her young face. I bring danger to you. Maybe I should go, even if wound is not perfect healed. You brought purpose, Tobias said firmly. First time in 3 years, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something that Elizabeth would be proud of. A few angry townspeople who've never met you and don't know the truth, that's not worth worrying about. But if they come, if they cause trouble for you because of me, then we'll handle it together, Tobias interrupted. You're not alone in this, Naichi, and neither am I. We've got Ezra and the ranchers, we've got Colonel Crook's guarantee, and we've got the truth on our side. That's more than most people have. On the 17th day, Grandmother Stone arrived unannounced, appearing at the cabin door like a spirit from the old stories, her small bent frame somehow radiating more authority than men twice her size. She was 72 years old, and her eyes were sharp as a hawk's, missing nothing as she surveyed the cabin and its occupants. She examined Naichi thoroughly, checking the wound with expert fingers that had treated thousands of injuries over 7 decades of healing work. The scar was clean, properly closed, healing with the kind of precision that spoke well of the treatment it had received. From a medical standpoint, Naichi was ready to travel. "But are you ready to leave?" Grandmother Stone asked in Apache, her voice carrying layers of meaning that went far beyond the simple question. Naichi was silent, torn between duty to her people and desire to stay and learn more, to absorb more knowledge, to continue building this unexpected bridge between worlds. Grandmother Stone's conversation with Naichi was private, conducted in rapid Apache, while Tobias busied himself with chores that didn't need doing, giving them space for words that weren't meant for his ears. But he could see Naichi's face changing as she listened, could see understanding dawning like sunrise over mountains. Later, after Naichi had gone to bed, Grandmother Stone spoke with Tobias in careful English, learned from decades of negotiating with whites and missionaries. "You gave her tools," the old woman said, her voice like wind through dried grass. "Words and knowledge and hope. But you also gave her something else. You gave her father figure after losing mother. Someone who see her not as chief's daughter, or future wife, or political piece. Just as Naichi, just as herself." "She gave me reason after losing everything," Tobias replied. "Reminded me why Elizabeth wanted me to keep living instead of just surviving." "You both heal each other," Grandmother Stone said, nodding with the satisfaction of someone who'd suspected as much, but wanted confirmation. "That is sacred work. That is medicine deeper than herbs and stitching. That is the kind of healing that changes the world if we let it." On the final night, they cooked a special meal together, combining the best of both traditions in ways they'd learned over 2 weeks of trial and error. Apache herbs and spices mixed with frontier cooking methods, creating something new that belonged to neither culture and both, that couldn't exist without the meeting of worlds. Naichi read aloud from one of Elizabeth's old books, her pronunciation careful and precise, while Tobias listened with pride swelling in his chest like bread rising. She'd gone from not knowing the alphabet to reading full pages in just 2 weeks, and he knew she'd continue learning after she left, continue building on the foundation they'd laid together. They exchanged gifts as the fire burned low. Tobias gave her books wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from weather, volumes on medicine and history and stories that she could take back to her people. He'd been collecting them for years, and now they had a purpose. Naichi gave him a woven bracelet she'd made secretly during her recovery, using techniques her mother had taught her, and materials she'd gathered from around the cabin. The pattern told a story in symbols he couldn't read, but could feel. Something about two paths crossing and becoming one. "You are family now," she said, tying it around his wrist with fingers that no longer trembled. "Distance cannot change this. Time cannot break this. You are my teacher and my friend and my father bear. Always." Neither wanted morning to come. Both knew it must. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire burned down to coals, understanding passing between them that was deeper than any words in any language could express. Tomorrow the world would intrude again. Tomorrow there would be politics and danger and the weight of other people's expectations. But tonight, there was just peace and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd built something real. A bridge must have two sides. You cannot be a bridge if you stand only on one. The wisdom Grandmother Stone had shared with Naichi settled over both of them like a blessing, giving shape to what came next. Cochise arrived at dawn on the 18th day with a small group of 10 warriors, approaching peacefully with weapons secured and no war paint marking their faces. The contrast to that first morning couldn't have been sharper. Then 50 warriors had surrounded the cabin with death in their eyes and vengeance in their hearts. Now a father came to collect his daughter, with hope tempered by caution, pride mixed with the eternal worry that all parents carry. He saw Naichi standing on the porch waiting for him, healthy and smiling, and changed in ways that went far beyond the healed wound in her shoulder. The transformation in his daughter's face told him more than words ever could. She stood straighter, carried herself with new confidence, held books in her arms like they were treasures worth more than gold. Relief and pride washed across Cochise's weathered features as he dismounted and walked slowly toward the cabin, taking in every detail. His daughter was alive. More than alive, she was thriving in ways he hadn't expected, hadn't dared hope for when he'd left her here 2 weeks ago. "Father," Naichi said in Apache, her voice steady and sure. "Come. I want to show you something." She led him inside the cabin, while Tobias waited on the porch with the 10 warriors, an awkward silence settling over them, until one of the younger men asked in broken English about the rifle Tobias carried. Before long, they were discussing weapons and hunting with the universal language of men who respected skill and craftsmanship, barriers falling away when the conversation turned to practical matters. Inside, Naichi demonstrated her learning. She chose a passage from one of the medical textbooks, a section about treating infections and fevers, and read it aloud in English. Her pronunciation was clear and careful, each word given its proper weight and attention. Then she took a piece of paper and wrote her name in careful letters, followed by several complete sentences describing what she'd learned. Cochise watched in stunned silence, his dark eyes widening with each word his daughter read, each letter she formed. This was power. Knowledge was power. The kind of power that couldn't be taken away by force or treaty. The kind that could help his people survive in a world that was changing whether they wanted it to or not. "This is what white children learn?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he didn't bother hiding. Yes, Nietzsche replied. And this is what Apache children could learn too. If we had teachers, if we had books, if we built bridges instead of walls. Cochise looked at his daughter for a long moment, seeing not the wounded girl he'd left behind, but a young woman with vision that extended beyond the next battle or the next season. She was seeing years ahead, generations ahead, planning for a future where Apache survival meant adaptation rather than extinction. He stepped outside and called for Tobias, his voice carrying authority that made the warriors stop their conversation and stand at attention. Tobias came down from the porch, moving with the careful respect of a man entering another man's territory. "You kept your promise," Cochise said, gesturing toward Nietzsche, who stood in the doorway with books still in her arms. "My daughter is safe. She is healthy. She is more than when I left her." "She taught me as much as I taught her," Tobias replied honestly. "Maybe more. Your wife trained her well in medicine, and she's got a mind that learns faster than anyone I've ever seen." Tobias pulled the medicine bag from his belt, the intricate beadwork catching the morning light, and offered it back to Cochise. "She doesn't need protection anymore. She is protection. She's strong enough to protect herself and teach others to be strong too." But Cochise refused to take it, closing Tobias's fingers around the soft leather with both of his calloused hands. "No, you keep this. You are family now. This marks it, makes it permanent. While you wear this, you have Apache protection, forever. And you have my personal word as Cochise the Younger, son of the great chief, that no harm will come to you from our people." The weight of that promise hung in the morning air, heavier than the medicine bag, more permanent than any treaty signed by politicians who'd never set foot in these mountains. Nietzsche stepped forward, her voice carrying the conviction that had been building during 2 weeks of learning and thinking and planning. "Father, I want to continue this. I want to bring what I've learned back to our people. I want to teach our children to read and write, not so they become white, but so they can survive." She spoke rapidly in Apache, laying out a vision that was revolutionary in its scope. Schools on the reservation, teachers who understood both Apache and white ways, children learning to read treaties before they signed them, understanding the legal language that had been used to cheat and manipulate their people for generations. A new generation that could navigate both worlds instead of being crushed between them. Cochise listened, his face unreadable, but Tobias could see the wheels turning behind those dark eyes. This was dangerous thinking, the kind that could split a tribe between those who saw it as survival and those who saw it as surrender. But it was also the kind of thinking that might actually work, that might give his people a future beyond reservations and broken promises. "And you, Bear McCrae," Cochise said, turning to Tobias with an intensity that made the rancher straighten unconsciously. "Would you help with this dream my daughter has? Would you come to our territory, bring books and knowledge, teach our children?" Tobias felt the weight of the question, understood that what he said next would shape not just his own future, but potentially the futures of hundreds of people he'd never meet. He thought about Elizabeth, about how she'd believed in healing and teaching and building bridges. He thought about the past 2 weeks, about how alive he'd felt for the first time since her death. "I'm no teacher," he said slowly, honestly. "I'm a mountain man who barely finished school himself. I can shoot straight and track game and survive winters. But standing up in front of a classroom full of children, That's not something I know how to do." He paused, seeing disappointment starting to cloud Naichi's face, then continued. "But for Naichi, for her dream, for the chance to build something that matters, I'll try. I'll come every few months. I'll bring books and supplies. I'll teach what I can and learn from your people what I don't know. I can't promise I'll be good at it, but I can promise I'll do my best." Cochise extended his arm, not in the white man's handshake, but in the warrior's clasp, forearm to forearm. The grip that said equals stood before each other. Tobias took it, feeling the strength in those weathered hands, the calluses from a lifetime of holding weapons and reins. "We are allies," Cochise said formally, his words carrying the weight of oath and promise. "More than allies. We are family. My daughter's family. My family." Promises don't need papers when men of honor stand before each other and give their word. The bond was sealed not with ink and wax, but with respect earned through blood and fire, with trust built on actions rather than empty statements. Naichi mounted her horse, her movements still slightly careful around the healing wound, but confident and sure. She took one last long look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary and her schoolhouse, at the rough wooden walls that had protected her and the simple interior that had become a place of transformation. She waved to Tobias, her eyes bright with tears and hope and determination mixed together. "See you soon, Father Bear. I will make you proud. I will make Mother proud. I will build the bridge." "You already have, little warrior," Tobias called back, his own throat tight with emotion he hadn't expected. "You already have." The Apache departed slowly, not with the urgency of that first morning, but with the measured pace of people who knew they'd be back, who knew this was beginning rather than ending. Tobias stood on his porch and watched until they disappeared into the mountains, until the last horse was just a dark speck against the green slopes, until even the dust they'd raised had settled back to earth. The cabin felt empty after they left, the silence oppressive after 2 weeks of conversation and laughter and learning. Tobias walked inside and saw the books Naichi had practiced with still stacked on the table, saw the corner where she'd slept, saw the traces of her presence everywhere. But instead of the crushing loneliness he'd felt after Elizabeth died, he felt something else. Purpose. Hope. The knowledge that this wasn't an ending, but a transformation. 6 months later, winter had settled over the Sierra Nevada like a white blanket, turning the mountains into a landscape of incredible beauty and mortal danger. Tobias made the journey to the Apache reservation for the first time, his packhorse loaded with books and paper and pencils, with slates for writing and primers for reading, and medical texts that Naichi had specifically requested. The reservation was smaller than he'd expected, more crowded, the lodges packed closer together than traditional Apache camps would have been. This was government land, parceled out like charity, barely enough to support the people who'd once ranged across hundreds of miles. But there was life here, too. Children playing in the snow, women working hides, men caring for horses that were too thin but still proud. Naichi met him at the edge of the camp, no longer the wounded girl he'd found behind a fallen tree, but a young woman of 18, with authority in her bearing and determination in her eyes. She'd been preparing for this, talking to families, convincing skeptical parents that white man's learning wouldn't corrupt their children but protect them. She'd gathered 15 students for that first class, boys and girls together, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. They sat in a large lodge that had been cleared for teaching, looking at Tobias with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to cautious hope. Tobias had never been more nervous in his life, not facing down grizzly bears or winter storms or 50 armed warriors. But Naichi was there beside him, translating when needed, encouraging when he stumbled, bridging the gap between his rough frontier teaching style and her students' needs. They started with the alphabet, with simple words that connected to things the children already knew. Horse, arrow, fire, mother, father, sky. Each word was a brick in a bridge they were building together, a path between worlds that might lead somewhere better than endless war. The children learned fast, their young minds absorbing knowledge with the same hunger Naichi had shown. Within weeks, some of the older ones were reading simple sentences. Within months, they were writing letters to family members on other reservations, communicating in ways that government officials couldn't intercept or censor. And Tobias learned too. He learned Apache stories and history, learned about their conception of honor and family that wasn't so different from his own, learned tracking and hunting techniques that made him better at his own work. The teaching went both directions, knowledge flowing like water finding its level, enriching both sides. By spring of 1879, Tobias's cabin had become something unexpected. Neutral ground, sacred space, a place where Apache and white ranchers could meet without weapons, without fear, without the weight of generations of hatred pressing down on them. Ezra Blackwood and Cochise became unlikely friends, bonding over tobacco and horses and the shared frustration of dealing with stubborn people on both sides who preferred fighting to thinking. Once a month, they'd meet at Tobias's cabin with a dozen other men from both communities, working through disputes and misunderstandings before they could escalate into violence. A missing cow that had wandered onto reservation land was returned with apologies instead of starting a range war. A young Apache hunter who'd accidentally crossed into settler territory was escorted back safely instead of being shot on sight. Small victories, maybe, but they added up to something larger, a pattern of peace that spread slowly across the region. McCrae's clearing became known throughout 3 counties as the place where problems could be solved with words instead of bullets. Travelers knew they could stop there and be safe, regardless of which side they came from. Children from both communities sometimes played together under Tobias's watchful eye, learning each other's games and slowly, almost without realizing it, seeing each other as people rather than enemies. By 1880, with Colonel Crook's political backing and funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they established a formal school on the reservation. It was a rough building, nothing fancy, but it had a roof that didn't leak, and walls that kept out the worst of the winter cold, and space for 30 students to learn in relative comfort. Naichi became the primary teacher at 19 years old, though government officials initially balked at putting an Apache woman in charge of anything. Tobias consulted regularly, bringing new books and materials, training other potential teachers in reading and writing and basic mathematics. The curriculum was revolutionary. Reading, writing, arithmetic, as any school would teach, but also Apache history, passed down through oral tradition and now being written down for the first time. Stories of the great chiefs and the old ways, recorded before they could be forgotten. Practical skills like understanding contracts and legal documents, knowledge that could protect people from being cheated by traders and government agents who counted on ignorance. It was a balance between preparing for the modern world and preserving heritage, and it worked better than anyone had dared hope. In 1882, Naichi's education paid dividends that saved her entire tribe
from disaster.
She was 21 years old when she assisted as a translator during treaty negotiations, her reading skills allowing her to understand the dense legal language that previous generations had signed without comprehension. She caught an unfair clause buried in subsection 3 of Article 7, language that would have transferred valuable mineral rights from the reservation to private mining companies for essentially nothing. When a government official tried to dismiss her concerns with patronizing words about little girls not worrying about complicated things, she'd responded with ice in her voice. "This little girl reads better English than you write it." Clause 7, subsection 3. Do you even know what escheat means? Because I do. It means the land reverts to the government if we can't prove continuous occupation. And you've defined continuous occupation in a way that's impossible to meet. You're trying to steal our land with words instead of bullets. The official had stammered and blustered, but the damage to his credibility was done. Colonel Crook, now a general, and still a friend to the cause, had intervened to remove the offensive language. The treaty that was finally signed was still imperfect, still favored white interests over Apache ones, but it was fair enough to live with, and it protected rights that might otherwise have been lost. Tobias had been there in the background, watching Nietzsche dismantle bad faith arguments with precision and knowledge, and he'd felt pride swell in his chest, like he imagined fathers felt watching their daughters succeed. She learned from the best, he'd told Ezra later, knowing it wasn't quite true, but feeling it anyway. By 1885, 7 years after that September morning, when Tobias found a dying girl behind a fallen pine tree, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible back then. Tobias was 46 years old now, more gray in his beard than brown, his body showing the wear of 15 years of mountain living. But he was alive in ways he hadn't been since Elizabeth died. His cabin was filled with books and maps and learning materials. Children from both communities knew him as Teacher Bear, a nickname that made him uncomfortable and proud in equal measure. He'd become known as the bridge builder across the territory, a man who'd proven that peace was possible if people were willing to work for it, to learn from each other, to see humanity before seeing skin color or cultural differences. Nietzsche, at 24, was an accomplished peace negotiator who'd helped prevent 3 potential conflicts through dialogue and mutual understanding. Her school had grown to 50 students, with 10 trained Apache teachers working under her guidance. She'd written a book called 2 Worlds, 1 Path, an autobiography about her experiences that mixed Apache oral history with white narrative style, creating something new that belonged to both traditions and neither. She'd chosen to remain unmarried, dedicating herself to her mission with single-minded determination that reminded Tobias of her mother's dedication to healing. Some in the tribe whispered that it was strange for a chief's daughter to reject all suitors. But Cochise supported her choice, understanding that some people were called to serve their communities in ways that didn't include traditional family roles. On a cool evening in late October, Tobias's cabin was full of young Apache teachers who'd come to learn from both him and Nietzsche. They sat around the fire listening to stories about survival and honor, and people who'd chosen compassion over hatred, who'd built bridges instead of burning them. Cochise arrived unexpectedly, now 53 years old, with more gray in his braided hair, but still carrying himself with the dignity and strength that had made him a legend among his people. He had come to check on his daughter, as he did every few months, but also to see the legacy they'd all built together. He stood in the doorway, watching the young teachers, watching his daughter lead discussions about curriculum and teaching methods, watching Tobias contribute ideas from his own rough experience. The old chief's eyes were wet with tears he didn't bother hiding. 7 years ago, you saved one girl, Cochise said to Tobias later, when the young teachers had gone to bed and only the 3 of them remained by the fire. Just one wounded girl who should have died in the forest. Now look. He gestured around the cabin, but his meaning extended far beyond these wooden walls. 50 children who could read and write, 10 teachers trained and training more, 3 counties where peace held more often than not. Hundreds of lives saved through dialogue instead of destroyed through violence. A bridge between worlds that grew stronger every year. "How do you feel?" Cochise asked. Tobias looked at Naichi, at the young woman who'd walked into his life as a dying stranger and become the daughter he'd never had, the student who'd taught him as much as he'd taught her, the bridge builder who'd taken his rough foundation and constructed something magnificent. "Proud," he said simply, "and grateful. Elizabeth would be happy with this. Fighting hate with knowledge, building instead of destroying. That was always her way." "And Mother's way, too," Naichi added, her hand resting on the stack of books she'd brought for the new teachers. "They would be proud of all of us." The 3 of them sat together in comfortable silence, Tobias and Naichi and Cochise, looking at the young teachers sleeping peacefully in the loft, at the books stacked high on shelves, at the maps showing the growing network of schools and meeting places across the territory. The future was shining in their eyes, not perfect but possible, not easy but worth fighting for. One act of compassion can change one person. One changed person can change a generation. One generation can change the world if we let them. If we give them the tools and the knowledge and the hope to build something better than what we inherited. The final image, if this story were a painting hanging in some museum 100 years hence, would show 3 figures by firelight. An aging mountain man with a medicine bag at his belt and books in his hands. A young Apache woman holding a child's slate with careful letters spelling out hope and future and bridge. An old chief with wisdom in his eyes and peace in his heart, watching the legacy unfold. And in the background, barely visible, but undeniably present, the spirits of 2 women who'd believed in healing rather than hatred, in building rather than burning, in the possibility that even the deepest divides could be crossed, if people were brave enough to try. Tobias Bear McCrae lived another 23 years, teaching more than 200 students before age and the mountains finally claimed him in 1908. He died peacefully in his sleep, with Naichi holding his hand, surrounded by former students who'd become teachers themselves, carrying forward the work he'd started with one desperate act of kindness. Naichi lived to be 68, dying in 1929, after a lifetime spent building bridges and teaching peace. Her book was translated into 6 languages. Her schools produced 3 generations of educated Apache who navigated the 20th century with tools their ancestors never had. Her name became legend, spoken in the same breath as the great peacemakers and visionaries. The cabin still stands today, preserved as a historic site, a reminder that one choice in one moment can echo through time in ways we can never fully predict or control. That compassion is stronger than hatred, that knowledge is power, that bridges, once built, can carry traffic for generations, and that sometimes, when the world seems darkest, a single act of kindness can light a candle that becomes a torch, that becomes a bonfire, that lights the way for everyone who comes after.